So in this presentation, we'll talk about the lesson learned from the fall of Credit Suisse. So in this presentation, after introducing the timeline, we will also discuss the strategic failures, risk management, and capital management strategy employed by Credit Suisse, and we will also comment on the regulatory role in the failure of Credit Suisse. So as an introduction, there are scandals after scandal that lead to the final collapse of Credit Suisse. In particular, the Greensill and Archegos Capital cases mark a significant turning down points in the downward trend of Credit Suisse stock prices, which will be discussed further. So we have identified cultural risk as the key to explain strategic failure, which is shown in the center of the diagram. So the reinvention strategy announced by this former CEO creates significant pressure on management to achieve growth and profit targets, which discourage a prudent risk culture. So this decline in risk culture eventually leads to the failure of Credit Suisse funding and lending strategy. So notable funding failure is the collapse of Greensill Capital, which is an Australian bank. To boost the fund's growth, Greensill Capital started lending to high-risk debtors. As the fund's manager, Credit Suisse also failed to monitor the credit risk of Greensill Capital and rely on statements from Greensill senior management due to its fear of losing the customer relationship. So the excessive focus on profit also contributed to the subsequent lending failure involving Archegos Capital, which is a private investment firm owned by Bill Huang. So when its investment results decline, the risk manager in Credit Suisse has raised the concern and requested for margin increase. However, due to the fear of losing customer, the recommendation was rejected by Credit Suisse directors. So the inability of Credit Suisse to act upon the risk led to a final loss of 5.5 billion. So as for its liquidity strategy, Credit Suisse underestimated the speed of spreading the rumor across the social media, which makes it maintain an insufficient liquidity ratio on its book. In this section, we will comment on the risk management strategy of Credit Suisse. So the first step of an effective risk management strategy is to set up proper risk appetite. However, the only focus on growth and profit leads to excessive risk-taking behavior within Credit Suisse. As for its risk governance, Credit Suisse also failed to act upon the issue identified by the risk management team. So the second step is risk identification. However, Credit Suisse failed to perform due client diligence to identify the capital risk of its clients. For instance, in the Archegos Capital case, although there are various charges against the Bill Huang, it still decided to proceed with the lending. Furthermore, Credit Suisse does not implement an effective risk mitigation measure. So for risk reduction, Credit Suisse failed to cap risk exposure to Archegos Capital. As for risk avoidance, Credit Suisse also is the slowest to liquidate its position in the Archegos Capital case. Also, Credit Suisse also failed to effectively diversify its risk. For instance, Credit Suisse exposure is highly concentrated on the Archegos Capitals. In this session, we will also assess the capital management strategy employed by Credit Suisse. So we have found that Credit Suisse have failed several expectations from good capital management guidelines. Firstly, an effective capital management should address the material change in the risk appetite. However, the capital needs have not been reconsidered since the change in the risk appetite caused by the DM's reinvention strategies. Furthermore, we have found that some capital management strategy should be forward-looking. Although Credit Suisse claims its capital ratio is sufficient based on its benchmark analysis, however, it does not consider the changing nature of the external environment, such as the rising interest rate in the United States. So the above issues all indicate a lack of continuous monitoring of capital management to adapt to the change in the internal and external environment, which is located in the center of the diagram. As a last resource, the regulatory authorities of FINMA also failed to implement effective risk prevention measures. So FINMA claims the credit risk capital ratio is sufficient based on its outdated information, which does not consider the changing external environment, such as the rise in interest rate. Furthermore, FINMA tends to always rely on benchmark analysis to assess the Credit Suisse capital adequacy, which is insufficient to address the heterogeneity in bank risk profiles. Thirdly, there also is a trade-off between maintaining financial stability and controlling core inflation. So central banks usually raise policy rates to curb the rising inflation. However, that measure could increase tensions for banks. In conclusion, the failure of Credit Suisse provides valuable lessons for other financial institutions. So at the first layer, banks should establish a prudent risk culture to avoid excessive risk-taking behavior. Secondly, effective risk management framework should be enforced to identify and mitigate those risks. And the third layers, a forward-looking and continuously monitor capital management strategy should be implemented. As the last frontiers, regulatory authority should oversee the financial institutions and consider both individual risk profiles and the changing external environments. And the regulatory authority should also implement necessary effective preventive measures.